I have here with me Veronica Jacobson from MB, who is in charge of the Science Challenges process, and Prue Williams, who, as you all know, is now promoted. I'm not sure what her official title is, but she's basically in charge of the science system in MB, and they'll be able to help me answer questions at the end of the process, at the end of my relatively brief presentation. As you know, the government set up a process late last year to establish a group of national science challenges, and these challenges were a significant new component of the New Zealand science system, although they're not unique, and you might in a sense see some parallels with some components of the current science system in some of the platforms and in some of the cores, and I'll come back to that later on. But increasingly around the world, particularly in small countries, but you also see it in organisations like Gates Foundation and even in the EU, although with some differences, countries are saying the very contestable, compartmentalised, siloed approach to bottom-up science has its limitations, and that governments would like to see, and I think this is particularly relevant in small countries where scientists can't do everything, a more collaborative and cohesive and integrated approach to science while still maintaining the fundamentals of it being science-led and bottom-up led rather than the top-down innovation type focus that much of the science system has had over the last 20 years. So you can see this as a situation where the government was effectively trying to state that we would like to see the science community come together around a number of specific areas, but not lose that preciousness of what bottom-up science means. I think the other component was that while there's been a large focus on end-user-driven science in the last 30 years, I guess, since the 1990s, 20 years, here was a chance to see some rebalancing within the science portfolio. And so Cabinet agreed to the National Science Challenges, initially with an allocation of $60 million to be added to our new money, and as you all know now, there was a pre-budget announcement last week which added another $73.5 million of new money to the process, which means that it's about 133 million of new money added for the next 4 years, which, although the challenges are intended to go much longer than that, which I think makes it the most significant increase in science-led funding since in New Zealand since the Centre of Research Excellence was established about a decade ago. The criteria that are, and from the point of view of vote science, over a much longer period. These are the challenges, the criteria that Cabinet laid down in terms of what the panel was charged to do, and you'll see the criteria are those of national benefit over the long term, that it's an important matter, that science is essential and central to the challenge, that we have the broad capacity and capability to address it, and that we have a route to implementation. Underlying that was the thought of how these challenges would actually be operationalised, and you saw that in the concept that this would have structures which we can talk about in the Q&A part of this presentation, which is somewhat analogous to cores if they're in the university sector, or platforms if they're in the CRI sector, where there would be a virtual governance structure involving researchers and institutions across a broad range across New Zealand. and that it would involve collaboration. And I think one of the features of the conversation has been that we are focused here on scientist-to-scientist collaboration, not on institutional identity. That would define within the process a number of themes. The expertise existed, there was appropriate collaborative opportunities both within New Zealand and elsewhere, but it was also acknowledged that in thinking about it, there would be a large number of new collaborations that would be needed. And there would be a portfolio of relevant research by definition, if you take into account the other criteria that are listed, that would be integrated into the challenge. The other unique feature, and one that's has achieved a lot of interest from my colleagues internationally, has been the consultation process that was undertaken. These processes traditionally involve consultation with the scientific community, but it was interesting to see the effectiveness of the consultation with the community through the television campaign and websites. And I think that flows on from any of you who were at the Transit of Venus Forum last year in Tolaga Bay would see the value of that sort of hybrid approach that was demonstrated at that meeting. The Minister appointed an 11-member panel. I chaired it. The Chief Scientist, Mary O'Kane from New South Wales, was an external member. There were 8 other very senior members of the New Zealand science community, including Bill Denny, Peter Hunter from this university, and 2 younger scientists who made a very valuable contribution to the panel. We had about several hundred submissions, both from the lay and scientific communities, that were digested. And basically what the panel did was reflect and read all those submissions, then brainstorm through what the risks and opportunities facing New Zealand were over the next decade, where science had a central role. That led to a lot of brainstorming to come down to a manageable number of topics. The Minister was charging us to come up with about 10 or so challenges. And then the next step was to break those, having sort of dealt with the overlaps and the other aspects, which I might comment on in a moment, to try and bring it down to what were the probable themes that would underlie the headline challenge, because the headline means nothing. The real content in these challenges is within the definition of themes. And I think one of the problems in the media is it's focused on the headlines and not gone down to the next layer of detail, which is in the challenges, and then give some exemplars of the kind of research that could be done. The panel proposed 12 challenges plus one special one I'll come back to at the end. It also identified a number of other issues in the report. For example, it was very clear from the submissions that a lot of people were concerned about the application of current knowledge to making decisions which would benefit New Zealand, and the obvious gap between what we know and how it's used. And the panel would agree with that and commented quite strongly on that, although that that is not what the science challenges were about. Secondly, there was a lot of comments in a similar vein about the need to enhance the use of science in policy formation and in terms of the gaps within STEM education. I'll come back to that later. The report was presented to the Minister at the end of March. And as you know, last week the Cabinet had approved 10 challenges by combining 2, biosecurity and biodiversity, into one. And in fact, the panel itself had struggled along the line with whether it was to lump those 2 or to separate those 2. And in fact, that was probably the biggest challenge the panel had in general, was making the challenges broad enough to be appropriate to meet the other criteria, but not making them so broad that they were not functional units which could be managed by an integrated entity, and on the other hand making them not so narrow that they were actually serving a very narrow purpose. The other challenge, was the 12th challenge, was deferred. It was about improving urban design, both from the point, in lots of ways, from the engineering aspects to the social science aspects, and that's been deferred because Building Research Association of New Zealand is doing a strategic plan at the same time, and as you know, they're getting an uplift in access to taxpayers' money because of the impact of the levy on the building levy, that comes out of the Christchurch rebuild, and that will be considered by what to do about this challenge at the time later this year, once Brands has finished its work. The report itself, it's not that long, but I would encourage people to read it. It's available both on my own on our website and on MB's website. I think mine's slightly quicker to access, but that's all right. And I would encourage everybody here to read it, because I think without reading the report in some detail, your capacity to engage in the next part of the process will be limited. And so therefore I think particularly from 6 to 9 are very important in terms of understanding how to participate into the next part of the process. The challenges headlines have been announced and received various forms of comment. What I think is noticeable about them, and I think surprised a number of people, is the balance is quite different to what many people might have anticipated. There's 3 direct health challenges, there's several that relate to the environment, and and while all of them indirectly have some impact on economy, there's a relatively limited number of them that are directly focused on economic growth. This is the other 6 of them, and I guess none of them are particular surprise, nor would you expect them to be, although some people I think should read particularly the one around the Deep South, because I think that actually raises one of the major threats to New Zealand, which is poorly understood in a number of settings. But it was what underneath that is, I think, the important part of the process. For each challenge, the panel has identified, and it's all in this report, although we'll have to release a new description combining the biodiversity and biosecurity one, because since the Cabinet's decision, of the opportunity. What was the rationale for why this challenge exists, and what were the 2 goals? The goal that we saw for the science community, which is relatively self-evident, I think, but also the goal from the point of view of the community, why it was that this was seen to be an important area to focus on. And then the most important component is the next section, which is a statement of what we recommend as the scientific themes. Remember, there's to be 2 to 6 scientific themes per challenge, which should define the major orientation of where the work in that challenge will go, along with examples, and I emphasize the word examples, it's certainly not prescriptive, of where we thought the research was most likely to go to address those themes. There's also some comments on readiness, because some of the challenges are relatively coherent and easy to bring together, given the nature of the New Zealand science system. Others are much more diffuse and will need a lot of collegial discussion between the scientific community before they can be finally shaped. And that will determine, in a sense, which ones get moving faster and which ones will take a little bit longer to get off the ground. But the desire is, and MB's working very hard along with members of the panel and other experts which will need to be brought in places, to actually get this moving so over the next 12 months all these challenges get operationalised. Now what I've done is just picked out 2 challenges which I think might be more interesting to this audience of the 10, and just literally cut and pasted out of the report to illustrate the kind of detail that exists. This is challenge 1, the one of ageing well, where I think the issue of ageing is understood at one level quite obviously. It's increasing, the demographic changes are quite obvious, the way in which it will impact on social and economic life as well as on health life is obvious at a high level, but this is a challenge about maintaining people in physical, psychological and social health into later life. It relates to other challenges such as the challenge around chronic disease, but then you would expect that how the challenges are cut and divided and moulded is, of course, there are many ways that could have been done. And so you will expect there to be overlaps and integrations within them. The key issue is this comment down here about multidisciplinary and cross-institutional research. That is a theme you'll find in every challenge. This is not a situation like what happened with the Centres of Research Excellence in the early days, where various institutions tried to trade off with each other to get a position of advantage or the way they would operate, but rather as a desire to actually see collaboration across disciplines by scientists, where the institutional focus is not the key issue. The science and physical goals are obvious, science and social goals are obvious, I won't dwell on them. There were 3 themes that the panel, after a lot of reflection, came down on, and I think this is where the innovation lies within the challenges, because the innovation is not particularly at the headline, that's obvious. The innovation is in what kind of science and scientists we want to bring together to work on these challenges. And one of the common themes that comes through, for example, in virtually all the challenges, is the need to see far greater integration of social science alongside the physical and natural sciences in addressing these issues. And I think that you'll see this here, where clearly for this medical school, the expertise in neurodegeneration and the work on memory at a place such as Otago is obviously a place where we have strength to build on, but we've perhaps not integrated that enough with areas such as bioengineering in terms of biosupport for people who do have frailty and so forth, and how we think more about maintaining good emotional health, because they're all linked, but the scientists involved have not tended to be particularly well linked. The second issue is physical frailty, which is of course the big challenge for old age, and again the linkages between that and brain health, if you're reflective on them, are there, but we haven't actually seen that brought to the fore in thinking about research programs. And that leads through to the fact that there's in fact, and there is in many of the challenges, technology aspects such as the use of advanced bioengineering and robotics research in the elderly, and of course in New Zealand there's been quite a lot of work done in several places, what was IRL and the University of Auckland, on robotics research to try and help people in the elderly. And you can start to see how those things represent new ways of integrating in a rather innovative way the science of ageing. But put that in isolation from thinking about a number of social science issues, from the demographic to the psychological and the sociological, to the issue of how one might use the digital world to help people the elderly, who increasingly live in relatively isolated situations, remain productive and coherent parts of society, are the kinds of innovative thinking that went into the panel's thinking about what healthy aging means. So where this might, so I just give that as an example of the kind of transdisciplinary research which the panel was hoping to foster in the way it's framed the challenges. And I would put it to you that there's a large number of disciplines involved here where there would be value in a conversation integrating their research programs, but of which happened. Now the themes on the left are relatively clear. What I put on the right are simply examples, and we'll come back to how these examples will be fleshed out in consultation in a moment. And so in the readiness statement related to this, you can see the point that although there are some examples, the overall pattern pictures one of the groups working in isolation. And so we saw the major potential of this challenge is the integration of programs and increasing the linkages between the social, engineering, physical and natural and human sciences. The second one, by way of example, I'll just mention, because again I think this university has an interest in this area, is the issue of high-value nutrition. Research to develop high-value foods with health benefits. And I think we all recognise, and it was, of course, this was one of the examples used in the public consultation process, but it's been refined quite a lot, was to identify that the real advanced foods of the future are going to be those with validated high-level food claims. And New Zealand's done a lot to improve the regulatory framework in the last year or two in which that could be achieved. And of course New Zealand has real expertise in a number of areas. But what is interesting is the panel recognised that while the traditional model is the food scientists have an ingredient and they try and look for a health claim for it, which is the traditional way this field has worked and has therefore not been particularly productive, this needed to be reversed. And that the real issue here is to start from the clinical need to the clinical science to what are the factors involved that might make a difference moving through ultimately in the other direction. And again, that is quite, and it's one which is recognised by industry as well. So this is one with one of the more greater industry focuses, where that this is an important, innovative situation where New Zealand, because of the regulatory framework, is in a particularly unique position to advance this work. The goal is clear. We want to both get clinical benefit from food-based innovations, but secondly, from a societal point, and there's a whole set of steps which in the detail of this challenge, but we can also see what that would do to our marketplace. So the kinds of themes that were developed are perhaps different to the way in which traditional are indeed different to the way traditional food science in this area of functional foods is operated. It starts from the clinical application of defining where and what nutrition can do something, how one deals with this conundrum that if you're maintaining health, traditional clinical trials don't work. And that leads through to the issues of what is the sufficiency of evidence for a regulator to use a health claim. And then there's the need for an area which is relatively weak in New Zealand, which is nutritional hedonics, which that is, can you develop the foods with those claims, or that product, to the point where it's acceptable in the marketplace. And food-century science in the public domain is relatively weak. So there are just two examples, and the full report has another 9 of those, to describe to you, to show you the kind of thinking that the panel was doing beneath the headlines. But there's one other component in the report which I'm sorry hasn't had more public impact, because I actually think it may be the most important part of the report. And that is the need to improve the relationship between science and society, the need to enhance the quality of STEM education in New Zealand to develop the appropriate workforces, the need to work out how New Zealand can achieve social license for various technologies as they emerge over current decades. And this came through not only in the submissions, but in every one of the themes, every one of the challenges the panel was working with. We could have had a theme about workforce development, about STEM, about public consultation. And it seemed to us that the way to do this was to bring that this was actually stating that there was in fact a challenge for the New Zealand leadership to take concrete steps to address some of these deficits and to improve the understanding and aspirational use of science for New Zealand's development. And so we thought, well, it's not in our terms of reference, but we'll put a challenge to the bosses. And so we wrote the same kind of challenge for our leadership, and we highlighted 4 areas: science education, but we actually felt the issue in science education was the educational research that was needed to work out how to enhance science education needed to be strengthened. Secondly, there's been a large amount of rather disparate and poorly understood in terms of impact efforts and public engagement in science. And other countries have, for example, have improved the incorporation of science communication into graduate training. There's the issues of citizen science, etc., etc. And there was a sense that there was a need to do some thinking in this area. There's also the lack in this country, compared to most countries, of thinking about technology assessment and risk forecasting, and that was identified. And then there's this whole issue of how one achieves social license for science, which is linked to it. I'm pleased to say that the Minister of Science and Innovation announced in his announcement of the science challenges that government sees that this is a serious challenge. And I can advise that already the MB has appointed, has got a person directed to start thinking about how this challenge might be responded to by government. Now we come to the guts of it, and this is the last slide before we open it up to discussion, namely what happens next. Clearly this process up to now has been one of submissions, a group of people working away without political interference, I might add, to come up with a list of challenges which was only in the minutiae of the headline titles affected by the Crown. They didn't touch the content at all. But now we have to frame the challenges further and develop an overall implementation plan. And this is moving very fast. I think there'll be announcements, Prue, within the next few days. The starting point will be to refine the work the challenge has done between officials, panel members, and some invited outside experts where appropriate. For example, 1 or 2 of the challenges, there was a relative deficit of knowledge on the panel. For example, there was nobody with deep oceanographic experience on the panel, and there needs to be some more consultation done. Following that, and that will basically, I think, largely refine the themes and just be sure that the balance is there and make sure there's some sense of whom are the major players, not whom are all the players that are there. And then MB will host workshops or sandpits, depending on what language and jargon you like to use, with key participants, but taking a broader rather than narrow definition of what a key participant will be. In other words, trying to be inclusive to get people in the room to review the themes, identify the research elements that are under those elements, and allow MB, along with the panel, to identify who are going to be the key research participants for each challenge. Those people will be charged effectively to go away and work collaboratively across New Zealand to come up with both a science plan or research plan and the appropriate associated business plan around it, including addressing the issues of governance, leadership, direction and so forth. And I think it's reasonable to say that in the university sector, look at the core model of structure as a template under which you might be thinking. Those will go out to external review. All said and done, this is public money, and they will go out to external review, and subject to the review process and any iteration that might lead to, will lead to a negotiated contract between the Crown and the research providers, the research leaders, through whatever will be the appropriate host institution. I think that's all I need to say by way of a presentation. Along with Prue and Veronica, happy to answer any questions any of you have. Thank you.